ADHD is the same for males and females. That's true. But males and females are not the same. Or people without menstrual cycles and people with menstrual cycles are very different. And I noticed that the people I worked with that had ADHD had this very clear cycle of being on top of everything, having their support systems work, and then this kind of extreme, what they would term like falling apart, which was an experience I could really relate to. And they kind of thought it was random. And then I was like, can you start tracking your menstrual cycle? And that's when I noticed that that cycle had a very predictable pattern. Wait a minute. Yeah.
Hey guys, welcome back to the YouTube channel or the podcast if you're listening to us on the Digital Declutter Podcast. My name is Jenna, and today I have a very special episode where I actually have someone live in person, which is crazy. Sophie is an ADHD and menstrual cycle. She works a lot with both of those things, and I just have her introduce herself because we just met a month ago.
Yeah.
I have to have her on because we live in the same city and we both talk about ADHD, but she has such a specific topic, which is our menstrual cycle. For those of us who have them, I think it's such an important topic because she'll tell us that it is so under-researched, and I think it's important to really give some light to this, especially because it's something that basically every woman struggles with. So if you want to kind of introduce yourself and why you got into this topic.
For sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm just sharing what I've learned from this being a hyper-focus for a very long time. So my background is as a midwife, and just having had a lot of interest in women's health for a long time, I thought of ADHD very much as an issue that came up when I was in elementary school, and then I grew out of it. Like, I genuinely, that was the beginning and the end of it. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of was tucked away in my head, and I ended up stopped being a midwife because of my health stuff and really starting to take a step back and dig into what were the areas that I could understand better so that I could optimize how I was feeling at different times. And that's when I decided to start tracking my menstrual cycle, because I was wanting to try new treatments and interventions, and I thought that my menstrual cycle was a really good way to see what was working, because my menstrual cycle at that time was very irregular. And so I actually went into the Catholic Church, and I am not Catholic, to learn how to track the cycle. And it was, there's a long journey in between those two things, but basically I ended up combining health coaching and menstrual cycle tracking. And I noticed that the people I worked with that had ADHD had this very clear cycle of like being on top of everything, having their support systems work, and then this kind of extreme, what they would falling apart, which was an experience I could really relate to. And they kind of thought it was random. And then I was like, can you start tracking your menstrual cycle? And that's when I noticed that that cycle had a very predictable pattern. And that's when I was like, wait a minute. We need, because I really like to hack things, which I think
same.
ADHDers are like the hackers of the world.
I love hacks.
One of my friends always says, I'm going to scheme my way through it. Like, we always find the most efficient, the most optimized. I was like, let me hyper-focus and optimize. I need to tell everybody.
Yeah.
And that's when I started like looking into the research. And that is a whole other story about how I was totally shocked that we don't have much.
Yeah, well, let's get into that, because I think one of the things that has, at least during the pandemic, is there has been a lot more awareness around ADHD, and I just feel like there's been more talk about it, especially on social media. And I think it has also brought into the fact that a lot of women are underdiagnosed, but also there's not a lot of research on women, and most of the research on ADHD for the last 50 years has been on men. Yeah. And so I think, first of all, that's an issue. And but the biggest thing is like that doesn't track of our menstrual cycle. Like it's like not included at all. And so the fact that when I found out that you were doing this, I was like, why has no one been talking about this? It's kind of like when I started my ADHD and Notion Facebook group. I have 2,000 members now. Somebody should have started this a long time ago because it's an interest. Yeah. But for you, what the menstrual cycle is, I know that there's like 4 stages, but even that is not really taught in school.
No, I didn't know that until I was in my 20s. And I'd had a lot of menstrual cycles. Yeah. What you were saying is so on point about the research, because the research is really a reflection of society and who's getting treated, who's not, and who's being demanded masking and all of those kinds of things. And there's actually, so my undergraduate background is in environmental health, public health, and I think of this as like a huge public health issue. So we can get into that, but let me first just break down the menstrual cycle. So I brought these two little
if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the visuals.
Yeah, so I brought these two little visual symbols because I think it's easier sometimes to see. So our whole lives we're running on a 24-hour clock. You know, people who are born as male and people who are born as female are all on this 24-hour cycle, this circadian cycle. We're very familiar with it. Like, we would never plan to have a party that starts at midnight because like that's when we're supposed to be sleeping, you know, and we know that at like 2 p.m. is not when we're going to go to bed. Like, it's very intuitive, but that's actually how our menstrual cycle is. We're just totally removed from it. So when we go through puberty, or anybody who is assigned female at birth goes through puberty, they get a second clock. So we have this 24-hour clock, and now we have this extra clock. And I wrote 21 to 42 days. It can vary actually beyond that, but this is just like a general model. This is our menstrual cycle, which tracks a lot more with the moon cycle. It starts with your period or your menses. And that's what most of us think of as our cycle. People are like, did you get your cycle? Oh, did I get my period? And this is actually when your uterus is shedding the lining. So the whole point of the menstrual cycle is your uterus gets this comfy home for a fertilized egg. And then, wait, you're not pregnant. Let's get rid of this bed. So it starts with your menses, and then you move into your follicular phase, which is when typically people feel a lot better. That's when your hormones start to rise. That's when estrogen is rising. And that's all in preparation for ovulation. Ovulation is the main event. So your body literally is, here is an egg. Do you want to fertilize it or not? It's a 12 to 24 hour thing, which is also crazy.
That's like when a woman can get pregnant is within like 1 or 2 days, right?
It's, that they could only the egg can be fertilized, so getting pregnant for 12 to 24 hours.
That's crazy.
But semen survives for up to 5 days.
Okay.
So you could have sex, and then I hope YouTube is okay
in
saying that.
Yeah, it's fine.
You could have intercourse, and then get pregnant 4 days later.
Oh, wow.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
Another thing we should have been taught. There's a short window of time, which is also a whole other thing that we take contraception for a whole month. When men can get somebody pregnant 24/7, women can only get pregnant for 5 days.
It's so interesting.
Yeah. So that's the middle of the cycle. That's the peak point. So that's here. That's why it's a shorter window. And then after that, your body starts to have the hormones drop. So estrogen specifically drops, and something called progesterone rises. And this is the luteal. So this is the second half of your cycle. So the first half is your period and your follicular. This is the middle point. This is like the meat of the sandwich, and then this is the second half. And estrogen is dominating the yellow part, the follicular, and progesterone, the purple. Estrogen is linked to dopamine production in your brain. And so that's really important in the context of ADHD.
I really want to link this back to ADHD because you talk about like dopamine and different like the hormones a little bit, because one of the things that I found that's so interesting is we don't, as women, we aren't taught about hormones that much. We just are like, oh, you're gonna be hormonal. What does that even mean? There's the stereotypical, like, you're moody, you fly off the handle. But I feel like with ADHD, there's even more symptoms that change. It's like, does it impact us differently? Or how does the hormones of the month, I guess, correlate with ADHD, and how do they interact with each other?
Yeah, in a huge way.
Okay.
So you often hear ADHD is the same for males and females. That's true. But males and females are not the same. Or people without menstrual cycles and people with menstrual cycles are very different. So the best way I can describe it, if you were a male without a menstrual cycle, and I were to say ADHD equals, this is not everything ADHD equals, but a difficulty with regulating attention, emotion, and like sense of time, then you would have that as a part of how you understand yourself 24/7. For people with menstrual cycles, it's like, today you're gonna have these traits or symptoms or challenges. And so it's such a distinct difference. It's not this static diagnosis. It's a diagnosis that is like, you will have this cluster of traits that wax and wanes significantly throughout your month and throughout your life. So for me, I was diagnosed with ADHD as a 6-year-old, and it looked really different than it does today because I didn't have a menstrual cycle. And so my estrogen levels, so it's estrogen that is really connected to the neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine, but they're also learning a little bit of serotonin and norepinephrine. And all three of those are actually the neurotransmitters that are targeted with medication, which is important to think about. So we know how much they impact us. When progesterone rises, estrogen drops. So too do those neurotransmitters. I mean, this is like a massive oversimplification.
No, but this is fascinating.
Yeah, but this is kind of all we have right now. I mean, it's definitely more nuanced than I'm making it seem. And like people who have higher dopamine levels actually sometimes feel better in their progesterone time. It can make them feel calm and more regulated. But people, just generally speaking, that have ADHD and a menstrual cycle will tend to have a lower baseline dopamine. So when estrogen drops, those neurotransmitters dip so deeply that exactly like what you're saying, they actually have an exacerbation of symptoms. So much so that a higher percentage of them have a different condition called PMDD, so premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is basically PMS on steroids. And so it's exactly what you're saying. It affects people with menstrual cycles and ADHD very profoundly, and really also throughout the whole life, because people start having their estrogen levels drop when they're in their late 30s before menopause. So it's a whole thing.
And this is why I wanted you to come on, because this is all like new to me. Like, I mean, obviously we went through health class in middle school and we learned that we bleed once a month or whatever, but I just think this is just so not talked about. It's how, and this is maybe something we could maybe get into, is how to hack your cycle. I want to know what I should be doing in each phase. Like, I know there's different exercises and foods to be eating. Okay, like I've heard things where it's like at the beginning of your cycle, you're going to be super energetic, so get all of those things done. Or you're going to be really chill and mellow. You know, don't like schedule a bunch of things that week. So could you kind of maybe walk through each phase and like how to kind of I guess sync up with your own cycle?
No, there's actually, I think Alyssa Vitti is the one that has termed like cycle syncing. I mean, it was used before that, but she's really the one that's popularized that. And that's exactly what all of her work is like, how do you hack each cycle? So I want to just give a disclaimer that we're talking about a menstrual cycle that doesn't currently have an influence from pharmaceuticals or, synthetic hormones. There's nothing wrong with those, but it is a different impact. So this is just a body that's having its normal biological cycle in a regular way. So in that regard, I like to think about each phase correlated with a season. I think it helps us remember energetically. So if you think about we're actually going to start with the follicular phase. So here's a written document. I'll just describe it really quick. So your menstrual cycle is like the first few days of your cycle, then your follicular, then ovulation, and then luteal. This purple line is your estrogen that really rises in the first half and then drops with a little dip towards the second, and then green is progesterone. So I'm going to actually start with your follicular because that's when your hormones are starting to rise. And I think of that as your springtime. It's like that refreshing, renewing time where you kind of want to go out and do more. It's a really good time to start projects, maybe be more social, be more active. And then you move into ovulation. So ovulation is really interesting because it affects people differently. Some people actually feel really bad for a few days. They get this like flu-y kind of feeling. But ovulation is either people are like, I want to go out to the clubs and go on a date, or they're like, I don't want to talk to anybody and be alone. So it's kind of a mix. But it's seen as like a summer. Luteal is much more like autumn, where it's like the harvesting, kind of tying things up. Maybe you want to be at home more. Maybe you don't really want to plan a party or a presentation. And then your menses, which is at the beginning of your cycle, but actually kind of the ending, like what we talked about in the beginning. It's like when you're shedding. that's when typically energetically you feel like the lowest.
Well, I want to kind of sum this up here because I know we've been talking for a while, and you'll be able to listen to this full on our podcast. We'll just probably put some clips on the YouTube channel. But how do we find you? Yeah. How can we get connected? I know you have like a course as well. How do we reach out to you?
So my Instagram is the ADHD Cycle. That's probably the best way right now. I also have a website, sophiekrupp.com, and I highly recommend you put your email in my newsletter because that's when I let people know when I'm speaking, when I have new courses. I don't email often, so it's kind of funny that I'm on Instagram because my friends don't even think I have a cell phone. I am so not a digital person, but I love that it exists because I'm realizing that's how people get information, which is amazing. So I would sign up for my newsletter because I only send people things when I'm offering to teach. So I teach workshops, and that's where I actually teach you like how to track your cycle and strategies, how to hack it. I'm also coming out at the end of October with a t-shirt, and it's called I'm Feeling Like a Grump. And the idea is that you can put it on when you're in your luteal phase as a way to remind yourself that it is not who you are, it's how you feel. And the people around you, because one of the things that's hard is to actually communicate how you're feeling. It's a big challenge with people with ADHD. And the biggest takeaway I could say is if you're listening to this and you're like, I just heard a lot and I don't know what to do, just remember it's normal to feel different on different days. So you can stop the like self-shaming, like how come I could do this last week and I can't today, or it is normal to have these cycles of performance and emotional regulation, and that's the biggest thing I've learned.
This is such a good conversation. I can't wait to listen to it back and edit this whole video. But yeah, well, hopefully if we have enough questions, maybe we can do part 2.
Yeah, people ask questions in the comments because I would love to follow up.
And also send us DMs if there's an additional topic that you want to cover. Or we could even do like a live or something on Instagram or something, or on our Facebook group and the ADHD in Notion Facebook group, which I run. So yeah, let us know, and hope you guys enjoyed this video/podcast, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye!